Hi, second graders. As promised, I am recording our read aloud for today. If you were on our Zoom chat yesterday, you remember I am at school today and I am in the classroom cleaning up and getting all of your things ready for next week to pick up. So I am recording the read aloud so that you can watch it while I'm at school. So, chapter 17 is called Augustus Goes Up the Pipe. And we just read in chapter 16 that he was kneeling down over the river and scooping up the chocolate into his mouth. When Mr. Wonka turned round and saw what Augustus Gloop was doing, he cried out, "Oh no, please, Augustus, please! I beg of you not to do that! My chocolate must not be touched by human hands!" "Augustus," called out Mrs. Gloop, "didn't you hear what the man said? Come away from the river at once!" "This stuff is terrific," said Augustus, taking not the slightest notice of his mother or Mr. Wonka. "Oh boy, I need a bucket to drink it properly." "Augustus," cried Mr. Wonka, hopping up and down and waggling his stick in the air, "you must come away. You're dirtying my chocolate." "Augustus," cried Mrs. Gloop. "Augustus," cried Mr. Gloop. But Augustus was deaf to everything except the call of his enormous stomach. That means he didn't hear anything except what his belly was telling him, which was that he wanted more chocolate. He was now lying full length on the ground with his head far out over the river, lapping up the chocolate like a dog. So just imagine that in your head. "Augustus," shouted Mrs. Gloop, "you'll be giving that nasty cold of yours to about 1,000,000 people all over the country." "Be careful, Augustus," shouted Mr. Gloop. "You're leading out too far." Mr. Gloop was absolutely right, for suddenly there was a shriek and then a splash, and into the river went Augustus Gloop, and in 1 second he had disappeared under the brown surface. There he is. "Save him!" screamed Mrs. Gloop, going white in the face and waving her umbrella about. "He'll drown! He can't swim! Save him! Save him!" "Good heavens, woman," said Mr. Gloop. "I'm not diving in there. I've got my best suit on." Augustus Gloop's face came up again to the surface, painted brown with chocolate. "Help! Help! Help!" he yelled. "Fish me out!" "Don't just stand there!" Mrs. Gloop screamed at Mr. Gloop. "Do something!" "I am doing something," said Mr. Gloop, who was now taking off his jacket and getting ready to dive into the chocolate. But while he was doing this, the wretched boy was being sucked closer and closer toward the mouth of one of the great pipes that was dangling down into the river. Then all at once, the powerful suction took hold of him completely, and he was pulled under the surface and then into the mouth of the pipe. The crowd on the riverbank waited breathlessly to see where he would come out. "There he goes!" somebody shouted, pointing upwards. And sure enough, because the pipe was made of glass, Augustus Gloop could be clearly seen shooting up inside the pipe, head first, like a torpedo. "Help! Police!" screamed Mrs. Gloop. "Augustus, come back here at once! Where are you going?" "It's a wonder to me," said Mr. Gloop, "how that pipe is big enough for him to go through it." "It isn't big enough," said Charlie Bucket. "Oh dear, look! He's slowing down." "So he is," said Grandpa Joe. "He's going to stick," said Charlie. "I think he is," said Grandpa Joe. "By golly, "He is stuck," said Charlie. "It's his stomach that's done it," said Mr. Gloop. "He's blocked the whole pipe," said Grandpa Joe. "Smash the pipe!" yelled Mrs. Gloop, still waving her umbrella. "Augustus, come out of there at once!" The watchers below could see the chocolate swishing around the boy in the pipe, and they could see it building up behind him in a solid mass, pushing against the blockage. The pressure was terrific. Something had to give. Something did give. And that something was Augustus. Woof! Up he shot again like a bullet in the barrel of a gun. "He's disappeared!" yelled Mrs. Gloop. "Where does that pipe go? Quick! Call the fire brigade!" "Keep calm," cried Mr. Wonka. "Keep calm, my dear lady, keep calm. There's no danger whatsoever. Augustus has just gone on a little journey, that's all. A most interesting little journey. But he'll come out of it just fine. You wait and see." "How can he possibly come out just fine?" snapped Mrs. Gloop. "He'll be made into marshmallows in 5 seconds. "Impossible!" cried Mr. Wonka. "Unthinkable! Inconceivable! Absurd! He could never be made into marshmallows." "And why not, might I ask?" shouted Mrs. Gloop. "Because that pipe doesn't go to the marshmallow room," Mr. Wonka answered. "It doesn't go anywhere near it. That pipe, the one Augustus went up, happens to lead directly to the room where I make a most delicious kind of strawberry-flavored chocolate. Then, I read that all wrong. Then he'll be made into strawberry-flavored chocolate-coated fudge," screamed Mrs. Gloop. "My poor Augustus! They'll be selling him by the pound all over the country tomorrow morning." "Quite right," said Mr. Gloop. "I know I'm right," said Mrs. Gloop. "It's beyond a joke," said Mr. Gloop. "Mr. Wonka doesn't seem to think so," cried Mrs. Gloop. "Just look at him. He's laughing his head off. How dare you laugh like that when my boy's just gone up the pipe? You monster!" she shrieked, pointing her umbrella at Mr. Wonka as though she were going to run him through. What do you think about that? You think that Mrs. Gloop has a right to be so upset about her son? "You think it's a joke, do you? You think that sucking my boy up into your fudge room like that is just one great big colossal joke?" "He'll be perfectly safe," said Mr. Wonka, giggling slightly. "He'll be chocolate fudge!" screamed Mrs. Gloop. "Never!" cried Mr. Wonka. "Of course he will!" shrieked Mrs. Gloop. "I wouldn't allow it!" cried Mr. Wonka. "And why not?" shrieked Mrs. Gloop. "Because the taste would be terrible," said Mr. Wonka. "Just imagine it! Augustus-flavored chocolate-coated gloop? No one would buy that." "They most certainly would!" cried... Oh, I read that wrong again. That's Mr. Gloop. "They most certainly would!" cried Mr. Gloop indignantly. "I don't want to think about it!" shrieked Mrs. Gloop. "Nor do I," said Mr. Wonka. "And I do promise you, madam, that your darling boy is perfectly safe." "If he's perfectly safe, then where is he?" snapped Mrs. Gloop. "Lead me to him this instant. Mr. Wonka turned around and clicked his fingers sharply, click, 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 3 times. Immediately, an Oompa Loompa appeared, as if from nowhere, and stood beside him. The Oompa Loompa bowed and smiled, showing beautiful white teeth. His skin was rosy white. His long hair was golden brown. And the top of his head came just above the height of Mr. Wonka's knee. He wore the usual deerskin slung over his shoulder. "Now, listen to me," said Mr. Wonka, looking down at the tiny man. "I want you to take Mr. and Mrs. Gloop up to the fudge room and help them to find their son, Augustus. He's just gone up the pipe." The Oompa Loompa took one look at Mrs. Gloop and exploded into peals of laughter. "Oh, do be quiet," said Mr. Wonka. "Control yourself. Pull yourself together. Mrs. Gloop doesn't think this is at all funny." "You can say that again," said Mrs. Gloop. "Go straight to the fudge room," Mr. Wonka said to the Oompa Loompa, "and when you get there, take a long stick and start poking around inside the big chocolate mixing barrel. I'm most certain you'll find him in there. But you better look sharp. You'll have to hurry. If you leave him in the chocolate mixing barrel too long, he's liable to get poured into the fudge boiler. And that really would be a disaster, wouldn't it? My fudge would be quite uneatable." Mrs. Gloop let out a shriek of fury. "I'm joking," said Mr. Wonka, giggling madly behind his beard. "I didn't mean it. Forgive me. I'm so sorry. Goodbye, Mrs. Gloop and Mr. Gloop. Goodbye, goodbye. I'll see you later." As Mr. and Mrs. Gloop and their tiny escort hurried away, the 5 Oompa Loompas on the far side of the river suddenly began hopping and dancing about and beating wildly upon a number of very small drums. "Augustus Gloop," they chanted. "Augustus Gloop, Augustus Gloop, Augustus Gloop." "Grandpa!" cried Charlie. "Listen to them, Grandpa. What are they doing?" "Shh," whispered Grandpa Joe. "I think they're going to sing us a song." And that's where we're going to stop for this chapter. In the next chapter, we'll hear the song that they sing for Augustus Gloop.